My name is Ethan Brooks, and the funniest thing my neighbor ever said to me ended up costing him thousands of dollars. He laughed right in my face, pointed at the tape measure in my hand, and told everyone standing there that I had no idea what I was talking about. About 3 weeks later, bright orange survey stakes sliced straight through the middle of the brand new patio he had been bragging about all spring. I've worked in land surveying for a little over 16 years, and after enough time in this business, property lines stop looking like invisible legal boundaries and start looking as obvious as lane markings on a highway. I don't have to guess where a corner pin should be. I don't estimate. I don't go with my gut. It's simply something my eyes have been trained to recognize after thousands of surveys, hundreds of construction projects, and more boundary disputes than I can count. That's probably why I tried so hard to avoid becoming part of one myself. My wife, Melissa, always jokes that I spend all day solving other people's arguments, only to come home and avoid my own. She's not wrong. I hate conflict. If there's a peaceful solution, I'll usually take it, even if it means swallowing my pride. That's exactly what I thought I was doing the day our new neighbors started building their backyard patio. We lived in a quiet subdivision outside Franklin, Tennessee, the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways but rarely knew each other well enough to borrow a ladder. We'd been there almost 12 years, long enough to know every fence, every drainage ditch, every property monument hidden beneath the grass. Then Jason and his wife, Rebecca, bought the house next door. They seemed friendly enough during the first week. Jason liked talking loudly about all the upgrades he planned to make, while Rebecca mostly nodded and smiled as if she'd heard those speeches 100 times already. Within a month, they had contractors coming almost every weekend. New landscaping, outdoor lighting, retaining walls. It looked expensive, but none of it was my business until one Saturday morning when I noticed wooden forms stretching farther than I expected. I walked over with a cup of coffee in one hand and my measuring tape in the other, mostly because I wanted to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before Jason noticed me. "Everything all right over there?" he called with a grin. "Actually, maybe," I answered. "Mind if I ask who's laying this patio out?" One of the contractors shrugged and pointed toward Jason. "His design." I nodded slowly, looked back toward the forms, then toward an old iron rebar monument I knew marked the rear corner of our lots. My stomach sank a little. "Jason," I said as calmly as I could, "I think part of this layout crosses onto my property by around 4 feet. He looked at me like I'd just told him aliens had landed behind the shed. Then he laughed. Not one of those awkward little laughs people use when they're uncomfortable. A real laugh. Loud enough that the contractor looked away, trying not to smile. 4 feet, he said. "Based on what? That tape measure?" I smiled politely. "Actually, based on 16 years of surveying property lines." "Come on," he replied, waving his hand dismissively. "Everybody thinks they're an expert these days." "I actually am," I answered. "I'm licensed. If you want, I can grab my credentials and show you why I'm concerned." Rebecca stepped out onto the deck carrying bottled water for the crew and sighed before I even finished speaking. "Jason, we're already behind schedule." Then she looked at me. "I'm sure everything's fine." It wasn't rude exactly, just the kind of confidence people have when they assume the facts are automatically on their side. I didn't push. I thanked them for listening, wished them a good weekend, and walked back home. Melissa was watching from the kitchen window. "How'd that go?" she asked, before I even opened the door. "About as well as you'd expect." Meaning I'm either completely wrong, I set my coffee down and looked back out the window, or somebody's about to pour $1,200 of concrete onto my property. She raised one eyebrow. "You sure?" I didn't answer immediately because I hate speaking in absolutes unless I've checked every detail. That afternoon, I pulled our original deed from the filing cabinet, compared it with the recorded subdivision plat, reviewed the monument locations I'd photographed years earlier, and walked the boundary twice before sunset. Every measurement pointed to exactly the same conclusion. The patio forms weren't close. They weren't even questionable. They extended a little over 4 feet onto my lot. Even then, I refused to assume bad intentions. People make mistakes. Contractors misread plans. Corners get covered by mulch. So instead of calling the county or hiring an attorney, I wrote Jason a polite letter explaining my concerns, included copies of the plat, and suggested we verify everything before concrete was poured. I dropped it in his mailbox myself. 3 days passed. No phone call. No knock on the door. No response. Then Saturday morning arrived, and I woke up to the unmistakable sound of a concrete truck backing into the driveway. The truck rolled in just after 8 that morning. its backup alarm echoing through the neighborhood like it was announcing something I already knew was coming. I stood at my kitchen window with a fresh cup of coffee, watching 3 workers unload their tools while Jason walked around with both hands on his hips, smiling like a man about to reveal the finishing touch on his dream backyard. Melissa joined me, glanced outside, then looked over at the envelope still sitting on our counter. Another copy of the letter I'd written in case I ever needed to prove I had tried to warn him. "You going over there?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "No, I already did." There comes a point when repeating yourself stops being helpful and starts sounding desperate, and I wasn't interested in begging someone to protect my own property. I watched them pour every inch of that slab. Wet gray concrete flowed through the forms, workers floated the surface smooth, and Jason even joked with the crew about finally having a place to host football parties. Every few minutes my eyes drifted back toward the property monument buried just beneath the grass. It hadn't moved. Property lines never care how confident someone sounds. By lunchtime, the patio was finished, and Jason lifted a cold beer toward me from across the yard as if celebrating some shared victory. I simply nodded, went back inside, and spent the rest of the weekend pretending I hadn't just watched thousands of dollars harden on top of land that didn't belong to him. People always ask why I didn't immediately call the county. The truth is simple, because I wanted to be absolutely certain before turning someone's mistake into an official dispute. Concrete is permanent. Legal records are even more permanent. If I was going to force that conversation, I wanted zero doubt left in anyone's mind. So I waited. 2 weeks. Long enough for the concrete to cure, long enough for emotions to cool, long enough that nobody could accuse me of acting out of spite. During those 2 weeks, Jason acted like nothing had happened. He invited neighbors over for a barbecue one Saturday afternoon. Kids rode bikes through the cul-de-sac, while everyone admired the new patio. I even overheard someone compliment the size of it. Jason grinned and said, "Go big or go home." I almost laughed at the irony because, technically speaking, part of that patio had already gone a little too big. A few neighbors asked why I wasn't joining the cookout. I smiled politely and blamed work. There was no point embarrassing him publicly before the facts became official. One evening, Melissa found me sitting in the garage cleaning my surveying equipment. "You're still thinking about it," she said. "I hate being right sometimes. Then prove you wrong." I looked up at her and smiled. That's exactly what I'm about to do. The next morning, I filed a request with the county for an official boundary survey. No accusations, no angry language, just paperwork. That's one thing I've always respected about the legal system. It doesn't care about personalities. It doesn't care who yelled louder. It only cares where the evidence points. About 10 days later, I got a call confirming the survey date, Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock. I didn't tell Jason. I didn't need to. County notices had already gone out to both property owners, and if he chose not to read his mail, that wasn't my responsibility. Tuesday arrived cool and overcast, right on schedule. A county survey truck pulled into the street. 2 surveyors stepped out with tripods, GPS receivers, total stations, metal detectors, and enough equipment to make it obvious this wasn't someone wandering around with a tape measure. Jason walked outside wearing gym shorts and an expression that suggested mild annoyance more than concern. "What's all this?" he asked one of the surveyors. "Official boundary verification," the man replied matter-of-factly. "Requested through the county." Jason glanced toward my yard. I was trimming a hedge, pretending to be more interested in the shrubs than the unfolding scene. He walked over. "Seriously?" he asked. "You actually did this?" I set the trimmer down. "I told you I thought the patio crossed the line. You couldn't just let it go?" I looked at him for a second before answering. "Would you?" That question seemed to irritate him more than anything else because he never answered it. Instead, he folded his arms and watched the survey crew begin locating existing monuments. For nearly 3 hours they measured, recalibrated, checked historical records, confirmed bearings, and drove fresh stakes into every legal corner. I knew exactly what they were doing because I'd done the same work countless times myself. But seeing another professional verify it removed every possibility of personal bias. Around noon, one surveyor stretched a bright fluorescent string between 2 newly placed stakes. It cut across Jason's backyard in a perfectly straight line. Then another worker followed behind with orange marking paint. I watched the paint travel across the grass, then onto the concrete, then directly through the middle of the brand new patio. It was so precise it almost looked intentional, as though someone had designed the patio around the property line instead of accidentally crossing it. Jason froze, Completely. His face lost every trace of confidence. Rebecca stepped onto the deck, looked from the orange line to her husband, then back toward the survey crew. "What does that mean?" she asked nervously. Nobody answered immediately because nobody needed to. The orange line answered for all of us. Finally, one of the surveyors walked over holding the official field notes. "Sir," he said professionally, "approximately 4 feet 2 inches of this concrete structure extends beyond your legal property boundary." Jason immediately pointed at me. His measurements influenced this. The surveyor didn't even glance in my direction. "No, sir. Our findings are based solely on county records, recovered monuments, and independent measurements." Jason wasn't ready to accept that. He demanded another review. He insisted somebody had made a mistake decades ago. He even suggested the subdivision plat itself might be inaccurate. The surveyor remained calm through all of it. "You're welcome to request a second independent verification through the city," he said. "That's entirely your right." Jason did exactly that. A week later, another licensed surveying firm arrived, completely unrelated to the county. Differing equipment, different crew, different calculations. Same answer. 4 feet 2 inches? Not 4 feet. Not 4.5. Exactly 4 feet 2 inches. Watching that second crew arrive almost felt surreal because I already knew what they would find. But I also knew Jason needed to hear it from someone other than me. Sometimes people aren't arguing against facts. They're arguing against the person presenting them. By the end of that afternoon, there was no argument left. A contractor visited the property the following day to provide an estimate for demolition. I happened to be mowing the lawn when he measured the patio with a laser, shook his head, and quietly told Jason, "There's no clean workaround. That section has to come out." Jason asked if they could somehow leave it in place and pay me instead. I answered before the contractor could. "It's not about money. It's about ownership. If we ignore it today, 20 years from now, our kids inherit a legal nightmare." He stared at me without speaking. For the first time since we'd met, there wasn't a hint of sarcasm in his eyes. There was only the realization that one careless decision, followed by weeks of stubborn pride, had snowballed into something far more expensive than simply listening on day one. Jason still wasn't ready to accept what the surveys had proven, but the law didn't leave him many options. About a week after the second survey confirmed the exact same property line, a concrete demolition crew arrived just after sunrise. I remember standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee, hearing the high-pitched scream of the concrete saw before I even looked out the window. The workers carefully snapped chalk lines along the legal boundary, then started cutting through a patio that had barely been finished a month earlier. Huge sections of fresh concrete were lifted into a dumpster while clouds of dust drifted across the backyard. Rebecca stood on the deck without saying a word, watching thousands of dollars disappear piece by piece. Jason spent the entire morning walking back and forth with his phone pressed against his ear, calling contractors, the permitting office, and anyone else he thought might somehow offer a cheaper solution. There wasn't one. The portion that crossed onto my property had to be removed, no matter how new it was or how much it had cost. By late afternoon, the backyard looked worse than it had before construction ever started. The patio ended abruptly at the property line with rough, broken edges. The lawn had been torn up by heavy equipment, and piles of dirt sat where fresh sod would have to be installed. Once everything was finished, including demolition, disposal, permits, landscaping, and rebuilding a smaller patio that finally stayed inside his own lot, Jason had spent well over $3,000 correcting a mistake that could have been avoided by simply listening for 5 minutes on the very first day. What surprised me most wasn't the demolition. It was how quiet the neighborhood became afterward. The same neighbors who had admired the oversized patio during the barbecue now avoided talking about it altogether. Nobody enjoys watching someone learn an expensive lesson, especially when everyone realizes it never had to happen. Melissa asked me one evening if I felt satisfied. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Not really," I said. "Relieved maybe, but not satisfied." Winning was never my goal. If anything, I wished the survey had proven me wrong, because then everyone would have kept their patio, their money, and their peace of mind. Unfortunately, facts don't change just because we hope they will. About 2 months later, I was changing the oil in my pickup when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned around and found Jason standing there holding 2 cups of coffee. His shoulders looked different somehow, less tense than before. He handed one to me and said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't interrupt him. "You warned me twice." My contractor even asked if I wanted to double-check the property line before we poured. I told him the neighbor didn't know what he was talking about. He laughed quietly and shook his head. Turns out I was the only one who didn't know what he was talking about. I couldn't help smiling. Property lines don't really care who's confident. That finally made him laugh for real. We stood there in the driveway talking for nearly half an hour. Not about lawsuits or money, but about how pride has a way of making small problems much bigger than they ever needed to become. He admitted that once he laughed at me in front of the crew, his ego wouldn't let him back down. Every decision after that was about defending the first bad decision instead of correcting it. Honestly, I respected him more for admitting that than I ever would have for pretending he'd done nothing wrong. We never became close friends after everything that happened, but we became good neighbors. We waved again. We talked over the fence. We even helped each other after a storm knocked down part of the fence line the following winter. Looking back now, people always assume this story is about a man losing thousands of dollars because he ignored a surveyor. I don't think that's what it's really about. I think it's about what happens when pride becomes more important than listening. I gave him every opportunity to avoid that outcome. I spoke to him face to face. I offered to show him my license. I sent a written notice. I waited before filing anything official. At every step, there was another chance to stop, verify the facts, and move on without anyone getting hurt financially. Instead, every opportunity was replaced with another excuse, another laugh, another reason why everyone else had to be wrong. In the end, the orange survey stakes didn't embarrass Jason. They simply revealed a truth that had been there from the very beginning. The property line never moved. The facts never changed. The only thing that changed was how much ignoring those facts ended up costing. That's why I never celebrated when the patio came out. I just went inside, poured another cup of coffee, and got on with my day, because sometimes the strongest response isn't saying, "I told you so." Sometimes it's letting the paperwork speak for itself. Now I'd really like to hear your opinion. If you had been standing where I was, would you have stopped the concrete pour before it happened? Or would you have handled it exactly the same way and trusted the legal process? And if you were Jason, at what point would you have admitted you were wrong? Let me know down in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where you think the line is between standing your ground and letting your pride get the better of you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.